US just sent a third aircraft carrier toward the Iran fight, and Tehran just realized this war is far from over. Now, before we go any further, let's clean up the biggest trap in this story. Some people are saying, it's confirmed, the third carrier is already there. Others are saying, it's fake, it'll never happen. The truth is more useful than both. What's clearly documented is that the USS Gerald R. Ford has moved into the Middle East. USNI News reported Ford transited the Suez Canal and is now operating in the region. USNI News. What's also documented is that the USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group has completed major pre-deployment training. Navy.mil announced the Bush CSG completed COMP2X, a big step in getting ready for deployment. U.S. Navy. And what's being debated, very loudly, is whether Bush becomes the next carrier sent to the Middle East, making it a three-carrier moment, or whether it's being positioned as a relief, follow-on option. Even Forbes notes a third carrier deployment is unlikely, but discusses the pressure and the possibility of relief rotations. Forbes. So here's the right way to frame the story without getting played. The U.S. has already surged carrier power into the region, and the Navy is clearly preparing additional capacity that could be sent if Washington decides the pressure campaign must stay high for weeks, not days. That's the real signal, and that's why Tehran should treat this as not over, because the aircraft carrier isn't the weapon. The aircraft carrier is the message. And the message is, we can keep doing this. Now let's break down why a third carrier, whether it's already ordered or being positioned as the next move, changes the psychology of the whole war. Because a carrier isn't just a ship. A carrier is an air base that moves. It's a political statement that floats, and it does three things at once that land-based forces can't do as cleanly. First, it projects tempo, the ability to generate sorties again and again. Second, it projects flexibility. You can reposition without asking permission from anyone's airspace politics. Third, it projects endurance. You're not betting the war on one dramatic weekend. So when Iran sees another carrier being prepared in the pipeline, it's not just more jets. It's the US saying, you don't get to wait us out. Now, here's where most people misunderstand what third carrier really means. They think it's only about firepower, but the real story is stress and sustainability. Because this war isn't only missiles versus interceptors, it's tempo versus fatigue. It's who can keep operating when the headlines stop trending. One carrier gives you presence. Two carriers gives you redundancy. Three carriers gives you something that looks like a commitment to a long fight, or at least the ability to maintain constant pressure without breaking the rest of the Navy. And that last part matters more than people admit. Because the U.S. Navy does not have unlimited carriers. Deploying more carriers spreads the fleet thin. Forbes openly described that strain and the trade-offs of a heavy carrier posture. Forbes. So if the U.S. even signals a third carrier, it's saying, we're willing to pay real opportunity cost to keep this pressure on. That's not a small thing. Now let's talk about why Tehran realized this war is far from over. Because Iran's best strategic hope in a prolonged confrontation isn't necessarily to beat the U.S. carrier for carrier. Iran's leverage is usually built around three ideas: make the region expensive to operate in, make defense feel imperfect, make the political cost rise over time. That's why you see so much focus on missiles, drones, proxy pressure, and threats to choke points and shipping. It's not just battlefield competition, it's pressure on the entire operating environment, and carriers are central to that contest because carriers are both powerful and symbolic. If Iran can credibly threaten carriers, it can shake confidence far beyond the military domain. But if the U.S. can keep carriers coming, rotating, sustaining, staying unpredictable, it tells Iran, your intimidation campaign won't empty the chessboard. Now, quick pattern break. because this is the line that explains the whole story in one sentence. Iran wins when the US feels forced to leave. The US wins when Iran feels forced to stop. Everything else is just mechanics. So what are the mechanics behind a third carrier posture? Here's what it changes on day one. It changes the air picture. With more carrier air wings in reach, the U.S. can maintain more continuous patrols, more defensive counter-air, more suppression of air defenses, more maritime strike options, and more flexibility in where aircraft launch and recover. And it changes the response time, because when assets are closer and plentiful, you can surge in response to a spike without pulling from one single point of failure. Now, does that mean Iran can't hit anything? No. This is still a probability war, but the US is trying to push the probability back in its favor by increasing depth and redundancy. And redundancy is what prevents one bad day from becoming the war is lost. Now, I want to address the thing you're going to hear from both sides. One side will say, 3 carriers means the US is about to escalate massively. The other side will say, 3 carriers means the US is panicking. Both are emotional stories. The adult version is this. More carriers is how the US reduces operational risk while increasing political leverage. It's deterrence through endurance. It's not necessarily we're about to invade, it's we're not going away. Now let's zoom in on the USS George H.W. Bush angle, because this is where the third carrier story is being built. USNI News reported the Bush is wrapping pre-deployment exercises, while Ford is now in the Red Sea. USNI News. And the U.S. Navy announced the Bush Carrier Strike Group completed COM2X, basically a major readiness milestone. U.S. Navy. That doesn't automatically mean it's going tomorrow, but it does mean if Washington chooses to send another carrier, Bush is one of the most plausible candidates to do it quickly. That's the pressure point, because Iran doesn't have to wait for a press conference to feel the consequences. Iran watches preparations the way markets watch liquidity, quietly, obsessively, and with respect. Now here's why this matters for Tehran's decision-making right now. If Iran believes the U.S. is near the end of a burst operation, Iran can try to endure, disperse, reconstitute, and wait for fatigue to take over. But if Iran believes the U.S. is setting up for weeks of sustained pressure, airstrikes, maritime operations, constant patrols, then Iran has to choose between bad options. Do you escalate to try to create a shock that changes U.S. politics? Do you pull back to avoid being ground down? Do you shift into asymmetric attacks to raise cost without presenting targets? That's the menu, and none of those options look like this is almost over. Now let's talk about what a third carrier does to the regional actors watching this. Because this isn't only Washington versus Tehran. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Jordan, Iraq, Israel, everyone is reading this as a signal about whether the US is going to stay engaged or eventually try to exit to stability. A visible long-duration posture tells partners, we'll keep the umbrella up. But it also increases the risk that partners become targets of retaliation and pressure. So the carrier posture is reassurance and risk at the same time. Now, I want to give you the 3 signals that matter most over the next 2 weeks, because this is how you know whether the third carrier story is a real strategic move or just internet hype. Signal 1. Official posture language starts matching the logistics. You won't always get a clean statement saying, third carrier deployed. But you will see patterns, more official imagery, more mentions of extended deployments, more talk of sustained operations, and more readiness messaging. Signal 2. You see the rotation logic. Forbes noted the Navy is already stretched and discussed relief extension dynamics around carriers. Forbes. If you see one carrier's deployment being extended while another finishes training, that's often the pattern of a long-duration posture. Signal 3. Iran's behavior changes. If Tehran truly believes this is far from over, you'll see it in the response domain. Less about symbolic statements, more about asymmetric moves, cyber pressure, proxy actions, maritime disruption attempts, or efforts to stress energy logistics. Behavior is harder to fake than speeches. Now let's address the title line you're using. Tehran just realized this war is far from over. What does realized look like in practice? It looks like dispersion. It looks like movement. It looks like Iran trying to protect its remaining launch capability and command nodes under sustained pressure. It looks like shifting tactics to make U.S. intelligence and targeting harder. Because a long-duration U.S. posture turns every fixed asset into a liability. And that's the real reason carriers matter. They extend the window where fixed assets can be hunted. Now, one more pattern break. Because you need this line to stay grounded. A carrier doesn't end wars. It extends options. That's the point. The U.S. doesn't send carriers because it guarantees victory tomorrow. The U.S. sends carriers because it keeps decision space open, deterrence, strikes, defense, evacuation support, sea control, and political leverage. Now, what are the realistic paths from here? Path 1. The third carrier becomes a real deployment. Bush or another carrier is ordered forward, and the U.S. settles into a three-carrier posture for a defined window to maintain constant pressure and reduce operational risk. Path 2. The third carrier is a shadow option. The Navy keeps Bush ready, but doesn't send it yet, using readiness as leverage, keeping the threat credible without fully paying the global opportunity cost. Path 3. The story becomes more about extensions than additions. Ford stays longer, Lincoln stays longer, or other assets rotate in ways that maintain pressure without the headline of third carrier. All three paths still point to the same message. This is not a weekend operation, and Tehran can't assume it can just wait out one news cycle. So here's the clean takeaway. The USS Gerald R. Ford's move into the region is confirmed in credible naval reporting. USNI News. The USS George H.W. Bush Strike Group has completed major readiness training, positioning it as a plausible next move if Washington wants to sustain or expand carrier presence. U.S. Navy. And while some outlets debate whether a third carrier is likely, the key reality is that the U.S. is clearly building the ability to keep this fight going longer than Iran's preferred timeline. Forbes. Now tell me what you think is the real reason the U.S. wants the third carrier option on the table. Is it about launching more strikes? Or is it about endurance, making sure Iran can't survive this by simply waiting out American attention? Drop your take.